Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor Theta, our local designer Norman Rafferty, and our good friend and GM RedRabbit, and here today with us is our other good friend, Lessons Learned, here as our guest slot for today. When it comes to tabletop games, I have 15 years of experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rule sets at the table. Pronouns are he, him, they, them, and let's go with Norman next. Introduce yourself.
Hello, world. I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him. I work for Sanguine Games. Since 1999, we've been publishing Iron Claw, and we also do like Farflung, Madcap, that kind of stuff. It's September 10th, so in a couple weeks, we'll be doing our how to crowdfund or how to self-publish DIY 101. And so we'll talk you through it because we published, I think we're up to 17, 18 books now. I'm losing count.
Woo! Wonderful.
Nice.
Yep. Triple aces of crowdfund.
All right, Red.
Hi guys, I'm RedRabbit, a professional GM currently running games of 5th edition, Vampire the Masquerade, and Iron Claw, and an on-again, off-again thing with Dungeon World. I like to consider myself a student of narrative and game design, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, and Lessons.
I'm a Twitch streamer and YouTuber. Currently working on a form of Mass Effect Abridged. It's a new series on YouTube. Should be first episode should be up by the end of this month. I'm also a writer of speculative fiction. My first collection of short stories is on Amazon, Nights and Stars. And I GM for these wonderful crew of Raktus and on Sundays, Greyhawk, Into the Wild Coast, a 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons game in the good old world of Greyhawk.
Wonderful. All right then. So for today, it's the year 2020. Is it okay to say being evil is bad? I mean, I can only hope that next year that it doesn't become contentious. But we have with us today the curious case that in D&D you can play an evil line character. No requirements, no questions. Just write evil on your sheet. And to be clear, within the text of D&D 5th edition, the various evils are described as do anything you want as long as the legal system supports it, do whatever you can get away with, and arbitrary violence. Not exactly good behavior, but in the same book, you can also play Paladin of Vengeance that, as described, will track down evil and wrongdoers and let nothing get in their way of doing so. As you might surmise, having these two concepts in play will probably instigate a fight. And it should be plainly evident that it's not necessarily the fault of any players who would pick these concepts because they like them and the book said that they could play them, but rather that the rules that would have prevented this fight aren't there by design, and instead the situation's left up to an often very surprised GM to kind of mediate. So today we're going to be talking about how rules endorse these sorts of behaviors and where design can go right or wrong in guiding player decision making. So, who wants to go ahead and kick that off?
Okay, I'll start because I sort of been in and out of the discussion, especially when it comes to all evil races like orcs, right? You know, orcs are always evil, goblins are always evil, and you have the grown-arts, which I am, I guess by temple of being of my age, I'm a member of.
Of course.
Who say, oh, don't discuss this. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And then you have people like me. It's like, no, you should discuss it. It's, this is something that we should talk about and move on from. But for the rules who say, open the book, Dungeon Master Guide to X amount of orcs, it says, they were created by, influenced by evil deities and all that. And at best you have, a few exceptions to that rule, right? Your orc may not be evil, but orcs in general are evil. So you want to have the discussion about whether or not you should have all evil races, and then the latest version of Dungeons & Dragons says, but why? They're all evil, except for you, player character who's special and always can do whatever you want.
Say that. They say all orcs are constantly have the pull of evil. Really weird.
Yeah.
I was considering putting that line in, but I just want to make my intro snappy.
Yeah.
But yeah, they do have that exact text in there in that same very brief alignment section.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I'm always going back to one thing, topic that we have maintained in all our books. Rules endorse behavior. And what we mean by that is if you have a rule for something, you are telling people this is something we expect you to do. For example, D&D has short swords in it. They do 1d6 damage. At some point, if you were to take a short sword and stab someone else, that would be an okay thing to do. The rules said it was okay to use short swords as weapons against other people. There's been other games. Sometimes when people have like complaints about a game, they're saying, "Well, this game has in it the context of the rules something we find incredibly distasteful." There are a lot of edgelord games that have terrible rules in them. Of here we've mechanized doing things to people without their consent, and you could take the logic of like old school gamers, the guys who wrote these giant dungeon masters guides and that kind of stuff, often looked at this stuff as like a cookbook, like as in like rules you might use. You didn't have to use it. I mean, just because we have a whole section on spells underwater doesn't mean that we necessarily expect you to go through and use all of this. But that's not how modern games are written. Modern games are usually written with the idea that a rule and it's going to be used. And the entire idea of putting good and evil as concepts in the rules, like written down, this is good, this is evil. It's the game making specific moral judgments. And some history here, you had some pushback because 4th edition D&D, the previous edition, had text in it that says, well, don't let your players be evil. You can let monsters be evil. Any monster can be evil. Angels can be evil. All of them can be evil so you can feel good about killing them. They're evil so you can kill them. But there was pushback on it because people said D&D 3 let us be evil. Pathfinder lets us be evil. So in D&D 5, they put it back. But they, I guess I'm going to assume a lack of editorial oversight. D&D 5 still assumes that you're a good character. If you pick up something like Tyrant Queen, the campaign adventure, the evil Draconians, all clear, or Dragonborns, clearly labeled evil, are show up to Savage Coast and you fight them because you assume that you will automatically ally with all the good people and fight them. Or like we said, like every monster, well, most monsters can be labeled evil so you can feel good about killing them. But like you said, the paladin text still assumes that you would be good, even though you can play an evil paladin in D&D 5 because there's no alignment rules. So the game still assumes you would be good, but they gave you, they still have evil as a concept that pervades the rules that they expect you to be able to pick. And it's extremely strange. It's a strange wishy-washiness because it's like people got mad that D&D 4 wouldn't let you be evil, so they took it out of D&D 5. But then they just wrote the book like you'd be good anyway. So it's like, it's an incredibly mixed message to the player.
But that follows a very long tradition in Dungeons and Dragons. That's one reason why many games say, "Oh, alignments? Nah, we don't like them. Let's throw them away, right? Because we don't need them." Like, for example, if you're playing, if you read any introduction of any module in the Gary Gygax era, Greyhawk, it's like the forces of weal versus the forces of woe, right? And you're supposed to be the forces of weal, right? You're supposed to be the good guys, even though there was chaotic evil, and you could take that, right?
I can't agree with any of that because if you read all the old modules, it's like the whole S series challenge, like Tomb of Horrors. Doesn't care, it has a mixed party of good and evil because a king turns to a bunch of guys and says, hey, there's a tomb here. All of you owe me favors for some reason. All of you go investigate. Likewise, then you'd have Expedition to the Barrier Peaks or the Lost Caverns of Sajkanth, which are, let's mount an expedition to go to a far-off place to deal with it. Or like the Slaver series, my favorite, which is, hey, there's a bunch of slavers out there going around and imprisoning people and robbing them, and the king doesn't like that because they don't work for me. So I'm going to round up all you mercenaries who are willing to kill for money.
But I am actually quoting from the slavers because the description of slavers is like, oh, the leaders of the forces of weal, includes the king, whatever, have been da-da-da-da. It's like, I have my copy somewhere. Anyway, and then says, I guess, force of war, which are the creatures of the Pomarch and all that. So, I mean, it's all... It's
That's the
all
only
over the
mention I've ever
place.
seen of it. Like Greyhawk doesn't have any of that mentioned anywhere. That's neat.
It also in the Temple of Mental Evil, they say similar language. I've seen it before. It repeats itself.
Well,
What's
but
also
I mean,
fun and interesting.
in
go ahead.
terms of your heroes, like alignment. Alignment is kind of a weird concept because if you, well, not kind, it is weird. In fact, I'm against it because in original D&D, you had law and chaos. Remember, not order and chaos, but law and chaos because they ripped them right out of Moorcock. Moorcock's Eternal Champion series has law, which is rigidly defined and not fun and doesn't get anything done, and chaos, which, wow, let's do crazy stuff and be decadent and that kind of stuff. And that was an interesting struggle because you had too much control versus no control at all. You had in the middle, you had balance, not neutrality, but balance. And D&D needed factions, but they didn't do wheel and woe for some reason. That would have been awesome. They did law and chaos. And so you chose which side of ethos you were aligned with, who you would be serving. Would you serve the forces of law or the forces of chaos? And then Gary Gygax had his big dispute with Dave Arneson and decided, I'm going to rewrite D&D so he doesn't get any royalties, and decided that law and chaos were too vague. Everything must be labeled good and evil. This must be done. Also, women are weaker than men.
The absolutely necessary edit.
And talking about rules enforcing behavior, then you had a paladin who was supposed to be a religious, lawful good character who had instant ability to detect evil. So you always hear at some point in discussion was like, that guy's evil. So I'm going to kill him. I was like, but no, we have to have roleplay.
Right. And what campaign have you been in where the paladin or whoever has that ability doesn't just use it literally every 5 seconds if they can?
And also
are encouraged to do so.
Speaking as the gray-haired person here, also one of the last books that came out for D&D was Unearthed Arcana, and Unearthed Arcana had super-powered evil characters in it. Because you could choose to be a drow, who are all inherently evil. There's that again. And got spell resistance or magic resistance is what they called it back then. You got magic resistance, so you could just for free because you were evil. And then there were the evil gnomes who could summon earth elementals. So you could be a regular elf and not do that, or an evil elf who could do that.
And then it became even more gentrified because, and I say gentrified for a reason, because as the editions came out, and third edition actually was the worst, they cooked it into the multiverse. Well, which is a cool idea. But third edition had the fact that you have weapons that would do more damage against very specific types, like axiomatic and stuff like that. And
third edition made it what I call elemental, like did the Pokemon thing, elemental. But at least third edition had a little sidebar in it that said, look, good and evil are material concepts in this world, but they also restrict your class options. Like if you want to be a cleric, if you want to heal people, you can't be evil. If you want to, control vast legions of the undead, you really can't be good. And so they sort of locked those. That was the last holdover towards because previous D&D, everyone talks about the paladin, but you didn't have a paladin party because paladins had insane stats they had to roll. No, you had an assassin because assassins were better than thieves, but they had to be evil, and they got a free kill someone for free power that was incredibly vaguely defined. Plus, also they could use shields because assassins use. I don't know.
Obviously.
Right. So, you had those alignment restrictions. They said, like, okay, in order to be a paladin, you have to be good. And also, they had this weird thing. The last thing I want to talk about is they used to have, like, alignments were supposed to be some sort of role-playing. They were supposed to influence your decisions. In D&D First Edition, they would talk about taking away your paladin's abilities or cleric's abilities or even regular player abilities, not let them level up if they acted against their alignment. With third edition, they started talking about, well, it restricts your certain classes and some of the items you can use and makes spectrum evil and good against you. When you get to fifth edition, they've removed all references to alignment in any mechanical concept. Paladins do not detect evil in fifth edition. There is no detect evil.
They detect aberrations, undead, etc., and so goes for all the other spells. They affect the types rather than an alignment.
Which is weird, because someone's going to look up and say, what about protection from evil as a spell in D&D 5? And it's like, protection from evil actually doesn't work against evil. The text says it works against outsiders. It's so weird. And but they also felt they had to keep this text, and it creeps into the game where anything that they want you to be able to kill is labeled evil. Kobolds, evil. Orcs, evil. Bugbears, evil. And it's this weird thing where it started to flow over into the discourse of like when they started making more supplements, and people said, well, what if we want to play Uantis? What if we want to play Kobolds? What if we want to play Orcs? And suddenly it kind of like it I don't know if this is getting away from that kind of good evil, so I should probably stick with that. It's this weird thing where D&D and modern D&D insists on labeling everything good and evil, but doesn't insist on restricting your class choices, your power options, or anything. So in other words, there's no alignment restriction doesn't mean anything in D&D 5. So they kept the good and evil labels with these weird problematics of do whatever you want anyway, it doesn't matter, be an evil paladin, who cares? But they kept the labels so you could murder things and feel good about it. All orcs are evil. And this has gotten kind of ugly because people are saying like, well, we think there might be some like racially coded statements or socially coded statements. Because I guess the last thing I want to say is D&D is the only game that does that.
So thinking about another example of player behavior encouraged by the rules. So I think this is one that Red would probably actually be very familiar with. This is flaws in Vampire. Do you remember the rules for those, Red? And how they are different across these different editions and how players react to them?
Sorry, you're talking about the flaws rule, like the opposite of merits?
Correct. So in Vampire V20, you can take flaws at character creation, and they will specifically give you experience points, and then in play, the DM is supposed to remember these flaws and then put them out there. And what you see happening as a pattern of player behavior is that they take them all, and then nothing happens. So you're encouraged to just kind of optimize yourself with things that don't matter or will never happen.
I'll point out
later
that
editions, they actually start trying to fix this, and it actually kind of goes a little well. The edition of Requiem that comes out, the first one, says you can take a flaw, and when it affects you, you get experience. And then you have the behavior where players will attempt to maybe encourage it to get some more experience. They'll fish for it, which is kind of interesting, but still maybe a little gamey. And then finally, you have the latest edition of Requiem, where it says you can take a flaw and you just have fun with that, okay? Maybe you can put it down as an alternate goal, which will give you beats, which turn into experience. So it can function similarly, but it's far more opt-in than the previous versions. And so you see these different scales of player behavior according to how those rules are done. The rules endorsed you being a munchkin in V20.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. I would say it's interesting too that system shows up in a lot of places, including the first edition of Ironclaw had a similar take on it, where you could grab flaws for free experience points.
Yeah, we removed that.
And it's not in the second edition. Although it did sneak into some of like the alternate splat rules at the back of the book, which I thought
they were still first edition. No, we removed that because to repeat what Griffin is. So you would take a bunch of stuff on your character, and then expect the GM to remember that you had an enemy, or that you're missing a hand or whatever. And then if you never brought that up, then the GM might not punish you. But when we get back into rules endorsed behavior, one thing we were incredibly crafty about or specific about was we didn't put anything in Ironclaw that we didn't want anyone to do. Like, for example, in a game like GURPS or Hero System, which were some of our influences, you'd see stuff like Berserk. You have a disadvantage that makes you go into a violent rage during which you kill everyone around you. Okay. We didn't put that in the book because if we put that in the book, someone could later say, hey, the book said I could go on a berserker rage. I'm not just choosing to be a person who murders her. This rule book that we bought from professionals put this idea in my head that I could get points for this kind of behavior. And so we specifically didn't put things like that in the book. Later in second edition, we didn't put that in at all because we came to the conclusion that what Griffin said. Right. So that gets kind of back into that gets into weird questions. If Dungeons and Dragons says you can label yourself evil, then the book is endorsing that I will solve all of my problems with cruelty, violence, and other non-consensual destructive activities.
Mhm.
And the book told me it was okay to do this.
Well, there's another interesting thing there too, which is if you strip away all of the moral arguments, if you stripped away alignment and good and evil, um, and all of that loaded stuff, and you just looked at the core of the rules of Dungeons and Dragons, it is a game about stabbing things with pointy objects. I think this is where a lot of the rub comes from, and a lot of the moral hand wringing comes from when people talk about how, you know, entire races are represented as just being badder than other races. Because a lot of that stuff was introduced simply to justify the act of stabbing things with pointy objects, which is considered largely in modern society to be an evil act. It's only not evil in cases of self-defense or when you are going up against something that that's still self-defense, but yeah, something that threatens your very way of life, which in the fantasy Europe, you know, is monsters. Monsters threaten the villagers' ways of life. So even if you never met the ogre before, it was a noble deed to go out and kill the ogre, because presumably he was going to kill you or one of your friends or your livestock. But, you know, that is a very old view of what heroism looks like, and I think people are trying to reconcile that with modern tastes, right?
Yeah. I mean, like one thing I've been harping on in some other ones is the idea of parley, the idea of negotiating with your enemies is disgustingly absent from modern games. I'll just say that, because a lot of the adventures that you read and the way they're presented, you would go meet some monsters, engage in a fight with them, and loot their corpses, and there would be a note on one of the corpses that tells you where the next part of the adventure is. At no point in the discussion of the text is there anything that you might actually try to negotiate with anyone you meet. I mean, I'm sure maybe there's a modern exception to this, but I haven't seen it, where like every encounter, if it is framed as a combat encounter, if bad guys show up, they attack, you kill them, ask no quarter, and give none.
Right, it has to be very
frame-
specifically framed in this way. Otherwise, the default assumption is, yeah, this is a stabbing game. We're going to stab them, right?
Right, and as Red said, it's a stabbing game. Therefore, what I did was okay. Even if my character was labeled as good, what I did was okay, because the game has framed it that we will resolve everything in the game by stabbing things. Skills like diplomacy or persuasion, waste of your time. You'll just go ahead and murder everything you meet. And one perspective, it's a game. People play it to have fun. It's fun to get in conflicts and see kinds of crazy stuff to happen. That's fine as long as the game is framed that way. So, like I said, it's weird that the game also feels like it was okay to kill them. They were evil. Like D&D is the only game that does that.
I want to tell a bit of a war story, which actually shocked my old grown-up players back in the 3rd edition. Actually, I think it was 4th edition. They go in, they get hired to resolve a problem in the mines where the workers were mostly orcs and half-orcs. So I go like, okay, they're going to go and kill the player. The evil. That's what their bosses expected them to do, because that's what they hire mercenaries for. They don't want to, they want to break the strike, etc. So they go in. The first thing that the orcs and half-orcs will do, they don't attack them immediately. I mean, they have weapons, they're ready to fight, but they don't attack them immediately. And second, they say, we have grievances. Funny thing is, one of the members of my old party was a union member. So he was like, wait, you have grievances? Like what? And they started talking, and they resolved the situation, saying, listen, they just want a little higher pay and be able to be accommodated in these mines, because that's where they live now. They're being abused, etc. And they went back to the boss because we're not happy. But it turns out that now the player characters are the ones with the stabby things and spells and stuff like that, which the bosses didn't have. So it's like, okay, I guess we agree, because now you're on their side. But looking back at that, the reward structure of Dungeons and Dragons had always been you get experience points either for taking treasure, which either you avoid the bad guys or you kill them because they're in the way, or starting, especially in 1st edition, the reversal of killing the monsters, getting XP, and getting less XP or no XP for treasure, right?
No, you get way more XP for treasure than you do for killing the person. If you check the math on it.
In first edition, but I think by second edition
Second edition is a complex system. They probably changed it by second.
Yeah, in first edition they actually upped the experience of monsters, but it was in transition. So clearly in D&D it was basically you get more from getting the treasure than killing monsters. It was too dangerous. Don't do that. So over time and by third edition you get if you create magical items that you have to spend XP. So
yeah, but third edition it's you get XP for killing monsters and there's a sidebar and story reward.
Yeah, and that's the story reward. It's like if you do get a story reward, it's this vague reward, right? So even if you do have skills like parlay or talk or whatever, diplomacy, there's no reward structure for it.
Right.
That is left sort of like, oh, hey, you get a story reward because you solved this, right?
Yeah.
But you don't get the specific award where like kill a goblin, you get a 50 XP. Like
and before we have people coming in the comments, because people will say, well, technically there's the story reward that you could have given them for resolving this. The issue I'm bringing up here is this is not mentioned anywhere in the published adventure by the professionals who've presented it to you. That they don't present the idea to you that like when the players meet with the strikers, they might choose to attack. Here's the combat. Or they might choose to parlay. If they choose to parlay, this is what might happen. Like that thing I'm talking about where if they choose to negotiate with them, will not be anywhere in the text. It doesn't come up as an idea. And I want to mention that is unique to Dungeons and Dragons. You can look at other, like Palladium, which has a reputation for Rifts. Rifts adventures have the option to negotiate. When your Gonzo Guns That Fire a Mile and Blow Holes Through Continents game has options to negotiate, and D&D doesn't, the more down-to-earth Dwarves and Elves game doesn't, you might want to start to think about what's the message this game is sending.
Right. A majority of the mechanics are going to be about stabbing things, not doing the talking or negotiating a peace or hearing out grievances in a way that make people feel like you care about them.
And there's
There
another...
are some of the verbs there in skills, but some of those verbs aren't great verbs. Like, I think once Rafferty did mention, like, the way that he chose some of the skills for Ironclaw was specifically how he wants people to view things. If a negotiation implies that, you're going to do some sort of give and take, when it comes to D&D, you have diplomacy, where players just treat it as mind-wiping someone to do what you want.
Right there. I am so mad at D&D 5 because D&D 5 removed diplomacy.
All right, it's persuasion now.
It used to be that in D&D you couldn't do anything to anyone against their consent. With bluff, you could say something that they might that they don't know if it's true or not. With intimidate, this is third edition. With intimidate, you could make them afraid. They can still do whatever they want. They're just shaken. And with diplomacy, all you could do is change their feeling level towards you. If they were hostile, you could change it to neutral. If they were neutral, you could change it to friendly. You couldn't make them do anything. You could just change their opinion. D&D 5, deciding this was too difficult, put in a skill called persuasion. And persuasion is you just point at people and make them do things. And so it is like not... Once again, we're back to don't treat anyone in the game as a willful entity. Just order them to do things. I'm disgusted by that. But that why they had to do that.
I do think it bears underlining this because I think this is very obvious in Lesson's war story there, and I think we have been kind of saying it, but I do want to underline it, which is that once again, there's not a lot of mechanical crunch to negotiation, like we just mentioned, the skills that are involved that you can use in these kinds of scenes. But in the example that Lesson gave, it was not anything that the player characters were being tested by. It was the players deciding, hey, this is a bad situation. How can we solve this with logic? Which is cool. It's one of the great things about role-playing games. But it is another scene where none of the mechanics that you invested your time and energy into when you created these characters are being engaged by this particular scene. Which means that the rules are discouraging you from using those mechanics or lack of mechanics.
I mean, to build on what you just said, one of the great things about role-playing games is you can try to resolve situations in ways you can think of or in different ways. And that's great. And the issue with alignment right now is that alignment is framed as narrowing your choices and removing that, because the people who wrote the adventures don't think you'll try anything else. And then they framed it, but they're evil. It's okay to kill them. They do terrible things because they're clearly labeled evil. Like, the book doesn't even entertain that. So if that's a great thing about role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons is shutting down the discussion by saying, no, they're evil. Don't think about doing anything else other than the storylines we present, which always present you as good guys who murder evil people. Don't think outside the box. It's a game. Have fun. Don't think about it. You just want.
Now, talking about other games, and Ironclaw definitely does this. One of the cool things I like about it is a lot of games have what's called goal or mission oriented, progression. In other words, it's not kill monsters, take treasure. Is, depending on the wording, of course, like defeat the foe, which could be interpreted in many ways, right? It could be, hey, I stab them, or I capture them, or I drive them away, or do something else, right? It's about accomplishing a goal, and you progress from that, rather than simply saying very directly, hey, kill the monsters, here's how much XP you get.
Now, there'll be some people might point out that, like, in a game like World of Warcraft, they might tell you, like, bring back the Staff of Eponym, but the only way to get that is to go kill a boss monster. But
yeah,
I'm just going to slightly point out that Dark Souls 2, which is very inspired by D&D, has the great meditation where there's a guy who orders you to go out and kill people, but every single murderer has a way around it to get around the murder. And that is a deliberate, conscious choice by the designers, that you don't actually have to murder anyone. And it's hilarious to me because he's the most evil character in the game. And you can, like, I didn't kill anyone you asked for. Thanks for all the rewards, buddy.
That's pretty good.
But I do like this goal-based discussion, though, because I think this is another really great example of endorsing player behavior with the rules, because it gets players to think about what their objectives are, what they want to do, and that when they're sitting down to play, they should be going out to do one of these things that they've been told or that they set out to do in the first place, and not just kind of mill around and ask, like, so what are you doing today, guys?
Well, like an issue related to this, an issue I always have is, like, alignment is not useful as a role-playing aid, because half of your players chose true neutral, and the other half of your players chose chaotic good.
Yeah.
Okay. So if your players are ever in a situation that say, like, oh no, the wagon is overturned in goblin-infested areas, if we stop to help them, raiders might come and kill all of us. What do you do? And you ask the player, well, what would your alignment tell you to do? And half your players will say, well, I'm true neutral, so I have no strong feelings one way or the other. I don't do anything. And the chaotic good people will say, well, I'm always a good person, but only in ways that personally benefit and don't inconvenience me. So I can also choose to do nothing because I'm still a good person. I'm labeled good. It's just right here on my sheet, but only good when I feel like it. And so those two alignments, like, don't help motivate characters because they literally remove them from any investiture in the world. Whereas if you play like a more mature game, like a vampire game, or even Palladium, because Palladium has an alignment system, but they specifically, each one of them as, in a certain situation, what you would do in violent situations and negotiations, etc. Like,
one of the few things I actually appreciate.
Those sound like actual guidelines. That's great.
Yeah.
Have an actual, like, sophisticated system. So you could turn to someone and say, what's your alignment? And they would say, well, I'm scrupulous. And it's like, okay, well, that says you would do this. It doesn't mean it would inform play. So if a player are neutral, in modern D&D, alignment doesn't do is specifically written in a way to be as pointless as possible, but they kept it in the book anyway, which is like, it was bad before and it's worse.
I mean, I think I'll give the little bit of credit you can give to it is that it's ignorable, which I realize is just as bad, probably in your eyes, Rafferty, as a designer. And, like, why would you include something that adds nothing? But
I'm building back on rules endorse behavior. This gets back to my original question. If you were playing a game that had rules for doing horrible things to people, because there are role-playing games out there that have rules. I mean, come on, Vampire. You can jump on people in the middle of the night, molest them, and remove their bodily fluids. Okay? Like there are games that have rules for that.
Non-consent, like honestly, that just sounds like my Wednesday night. But non-consensually is the part that makes that problematic.
Right,
So.
but Vampire does have like humanity, which addresses some of those issues. But but this also, like, I'm not mentioning some of the other games. I'm sure people will mention them in the comments of like there are these games that have a reputation for being terrible because they had those rules. And I guess like the big one is there's a bizarre version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, first edition TMNT, that had rules that you could just randomly be a pedophile. Look it up, folks.
I don't remember that from reading it, but I'm not surprised that
In
it's
first
there.
edition, they had to redact it. You can look this up. They had to. I owned that edition, and it was
Gosh.
Actually, most of my books were after the bomb, so yeah.
Right.
There's also, of course, the meme out there of Fatal. It's like, well, hey, it has all these terrible non-consensual things you can do to people. Obviously, it wants you to do them, right?
Well, I mean, that's where we get into rules endorse behavior. It's like, well, if a game has terrible rules in it, but I ignore the terrible rules, is the game still terrible? It's that logic of how terrible would a rule have to be? Is a rule terrible just by existing? You know, like if it's just in the book, but none of us use it. You know, like to go to another example. You know, D&D has the rule. D&D First Edition says women are weaker than men, or D&D Fifth Edition. D&D Fifth Edition says all orcs have within them the capacity to be evil. If you're not, you could just say, well, I'm not using the alignment rules, therefore we need to have absolutely no discussion about this. It matters nothing at all. And I think a lot of people would say no. But also this gets into the thing, like I think it colors the conversation. When you read the published materials of Dungeons and Dragons, even though this rule might not be in play, the concept that bad guys are labeled evil and do nothing but wait in rooms for you to kill them because they've been labeled evil permeates the current design ethos of Dungeons and Dragons. It's this problem in the game where, well, I'm saying it's a problem. Many people would enjoy a game where you go to a place and kill a bunch of things and have fun, just want to grow. But it permeates the entire game where you try to get more morally complex stuff like Tyrant Queen or Dragon Heist or the Gripply adventure for Candlekeep Mysteries.
Right.
The writers and designers and well, not the writers, the designers and editors shut down that discussion. They say, we're not even going to have any discussion that you might treat any of these people like they have any right to life, liberty, and property. They are evil. Go kill them. Shut up.
I think also something we kind of be touching around in Rafferty, as you mentioned earlier, is how you write and what you say in those rules. Because you can have two systems that talk about have alignment, but the way you actually engage with that rule and you explain it, if you're very wishy-washy, like, yeah, we have this rule, but if you don't want to use it, that's fine. Versus like, no, this is the rule, and this is where we're going to do it, and we're going to be clear about it. I think that's a problem. That's a problem across many games, not just D&D.
See, I would agree with you there, because like one of the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is wishy-washy, where it will say like, okay, this is a generic fantasy system. You can do any fantasy you want. Like you can't do Lord of the Rings because our elves are weaker. You can't do Harry Potter, and you really can't do Game of Thrones. But you can do any fantasy you want. Moving on. They say that, but then the text of all orcs are evil and have the capacity with them is in the plain, in the plain text, formatted as in this is a true thing. As opposed to later when they might say, Dragonborns aren't in every fantasy setting. Like in the side, they're in, they're not in every fantasy. I mean, they're in Forgotten Realms and they're in Greyhawk and, they're in the only ones we care about. But
they weren't originally. We had to add them during a spell plague. Don't ignore this.
Right. Right. I mean, they're in all the published stuff we make. But moving on, the sidebars will say this is how you might format them or use them in your world and how you might do a relation. But the main text says, no, they're all evil. If they had moved that to the sidebar, I'd have a lot less outrage on my soapbox here, because it was like, okay, here are orcs. By the way, in many campaigns, they would be evil. It's like, okay, that's kind of bad. But no, it's D&D. If you like read the text and go buy the book that lets you play an orc, we'll just tell you, oh yeah, you suck. You're evil and you suck. And I don't know why you would pick an orc. You should pick a half orc instead. I mean, like, what part of the outrage right now is that when they presented orcs as a player option, they made them worse. And then when people got on the forums and said, why are orcs worse? They're just worse. They're evil. Why would you be an orc? You asked, we gave you rules, and now you suck. And why are you looking at us like that? Because suddenly, now it has racial and eugenic overtones. It was like, oh my God, and they could have avoided all of this if they had gotten, but they have this mindset that some things are evil and evil is bad, stupid, and wrong.
Yeah. I mean, but I also want to talk about what she is like. Again, you have the example of what is side text and what is core text, what is hard rules versus soft rules, right? What is implied versus what is stated directly. And going back to my example of mission goal system, you have to be very careful with that because you have to give some clear examples. Otherwise, it would be like, oh yeah, you're supposed to do this. But like, and how we're gonna, I mean, the only thing we have in the books are guns, so I guess, yes, we're gonna solve this problem.
Yeah,
But
my
the
verbs
only
are
tool,
shoot, throw, and drink their blood. I guess I'm
yeah,
doing all three.
these are all my tools that I have. This big gun, this big, flamethrower, this one that causes explosions at a distance, and I can summon a dragon from the skies.
Oh, well, I could even worse. Like, what if you're a fighter? It's like they don't even give the fighters like persuasion.
Yeah.
It's like, no, all you can do is climb and stab. But
Unless you pick a background that can sneak it in,
right.
But
I mean, I'm going to cynically counter that's not a problem for 99% of the games you're in because it's okay. They're evil. You can kill them. We label the. Don't think it's just a game.
Well, I think that. What am I trying to say? I think that it's also a good idea to look at this from the perspective of a player who is not examining things on the level that we are. Because when I think about a player, like let's say I'm sitting down to a new game that I've never played before, all I know about this game is the genre conventions that I know it's drawing from, right?
No.
No.
Sorry, I'm going to refute you on this. So, what you're talking about a new player? Like a new player shows up at the table.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, how new are they? Have they ever played a role-playing game before?
I'm going to say no. Never played role-playing.
And they don't know what conventions you're talking about because if they've seen Lord of the Rings, they're going to ask, why isn't my elf 200 years old and 7 feet tall? If they've seen Harry Potter, they're going to ask, how come I'm not, shooting ectoplasmic blasts immediately from my wand and can travel through time and have invisible cloaks? They're not going to know any of this stuff.
Sure. Well, okay, so they might not know the specifics, but they will know that, like, this game, there's tough guys with axes, and there's really scrawny wizards with long beards who can throw magic spells, That's the way that that's what I'm talking about in terms of, like, what would someone with no prior experience or knowledge expect?
Well, and I'm going to go a little off topic here and say they're going to ask you, okay, I'd like to throw a fireball. And then you'll tell them, no, that doesn't happen until 5th level. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, oh, okay. Now, in other words, when I meet players who have no expectation, they have no expectation. The entire idea of alignment is not a concept that people walk into the game with. They've seen My Little Pony, which has moral ambiguity and choices and that sort of thing. In fact, many episodes are devoted. They've been watching True Blood or Breaking Bad or Mad Men, which also have ambiguities and those sorts of things what people want. They don't come to the game expecting, what dwarves and elves are going to be because they're different in every fantasy setting. I mean, what you're describing is they would have to have experienced something else first. So when they come to my game, they don't know these things. And the book says, okay, write down your alignment. That's my objection to it. No, and alignment is not something people ask for when they come to the table.
Yeah.
No, that is very true. Alignment sucks. I'm not arguing that point.
Yeah. I think the thing I noticed the most about brand new people to the hobby who have no previous expectations will tend to act a little bit like themselves, which usually means that they will try to talk to people, try to understand what's going on, and then try to avoid conflict at any cost. And usually, if it's a game about conflict, you have to kind of engineer them back into fighting.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, they'll just go, it's like, wait a second, these kobolds here are attacking and they're stealing food. Maybe they're just hungry. And they'll attack the problem that way. They don't have the expectation that they're just there to fight them and slaughter them, so they don't treat them that way.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story that was popular a couple years ago on social media about these little girls that were playing D&D for the first time, and they meet some wolves, right? The wolves are hungry, and you're expected to kill the wolves because. So what the little girls did was they used a combination of magic and food that they had, and they just fed the wolves. And the wolves were happy, and they domesticated the wolves, and they went around with this pack of wolves that made them stronger and better, and they could take on. They actually did fight some other things that were really nasty, but
Right.
they understood that these big
this is-
puppies were just hungry, and
They're
And this is
frozen.
exactly what happened in real life in the first place. So it's perfect. It's exactly what does happen and should happen.
I mean, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because the first impulse of many players who don't know the rule, they haven't learned that the rules have shut down that avenue yet. They haven't learned you can try to negotiate with them, but you'll make a roll and it will fail, and they'll get a surprise round on you, and you'll take pains. They haven't been taught that hard lesson yet. New players are much more likely to think outside the box. It's the old school player, and like that's another meta objection I have, that D&D somehow became this default. Well, of course you have evil as a concept. We can't even get rid of it. D&D 4 tried to get rid of evil player characters, and people lost their shit. No, we got to have this back. It's important to us that players can murder with impunity.
So that's actually what I'm getting at there. If you look at the way the game was designed, the people who designed it were playing war games. It was built in at the very beginning that you were going to be killing wolves because that's what we invented this thing to do. And I think a lot of what the interesting tension is here is that people come to D&D expecting it to be some sort of like writing exercise, improvisational group project, think tank thing where it's like we can express our creativity, because largely that's how Dungeons and Dragons pitches itself.
Right.
And the potential is there for a lot of these games to provide that kind of experience, but I don't think that D&D is the place to do it necessarily.
Well,
And it goes back to my whole thing of like, well, maybe you should find a different game to play, guys, but we're actually going to do a topic about that pretty soon.
yeah.
So.
But also expanding on that, is I want to point out that D&D morphed into that. Like if you go back to D&D first edition, they will have the racial relations chart where they will say, okay, this is what humans think of other humans. This is what trolls think of humans. This is what goblins think of humans. Now, they all pretty much hate each other. How much do they hate each other? But that was built into the original rules where, and also there's another rule that's in D&D that you might as well ask why that's there. The language rule. Why is D&D obsessed with language? When does language come up in the game? When do you talk to these guys? Why do they always have a note on them written in the common language that you could understand instead of abyssal, which you might not?
I'll tell you what, it's just a blocking tool. It's to prevent people from trying to negotiate with the goblins because they speak goblin. They don't speak common. So, yeah.
Right. But in original D&D, it might come up say, hey, I can negotiate with these guys. I speak goblin, and here's a chart for it. They hate us, but that doesn't, if a humanoid, because they had, demi-humans and humanoids and then monsters, you might be able to negotiate. And they had a charisma table with reaction rolls on it. You could negotiate with certain monsters if they were negotiable. There's even D&D modules like that. The famous Loth one where you fight the Spider Queen. Speaking of labor dispute, the very first module in that is the Hill Giant setting. And the Hill Giant setting has a slave revolt in it, where the orcs that the giants have taken as slaves are revolting in one part of the homestead. And even the problem is it's badly written because they're presented only with their combat stats. But these orcs hate the same giants you do. In theory, you could talk to the orcs and say, hey, we hate the giants, you hate the giants, we'll help you get out of here, or at least can you let us at least travel through your space because we don't want to kill you. It's badly worded, and I think people took the wrong lessons away from original D&D. Basically, it's weird when the 70s version has in it provisions for you might negotiate with these people, or it's a long shot, but you might be able to do that, and has now moved into D&D 5th edition where monsters are now computer mobs where they sit in a room and patiently wait for you to kill them.
They simplified it down and then immediately lost the nuance and the point of that nuance.
Yeah.
So quick fire question, I think. So Rafferty, since you're one of the designers here, what do you do when you want to write a rule and understand how players are going to react to it? How do you write a rule that will not encourage terrible behavior?
Don't write the rule to have terrible behavior in it.
I mean, like, what's a process-wise or a thing that goes through your head when, like, you go back and edit over your own words?
Man, I'm gonna sound so pretentious. Because
Do
like
it.
in my head, I'm thinking about all the other rules that I have observed that that I knew could be bad. I mean, the X card, which 2013, John Severalpis, hope I pronounced that right, introduced the X card, which was just a meta rule that you could just say, look, I don't like what's going on here. Please stop. And you just throw a card on the table and say, stop. And we didn't want to put any rule in the game that would let people do stuff. I think one of the big ones, I want to give a shout out to Decipher here, pour a 40 out for Decipher. When they made the Star Trek role-playing game, like their version, one of the problems you ran into in stuff like Star Trek would be you would have commanders and you'd have like lower ranking officers. So in theory, some players could be Captain Picard and order people around to do things. And if they didn't do those things, they would, like that's against military protocol, you get punished because that's how a command structure works. And that's problematic in gaming because you might have some players ordering players around and players don't want to do it. If a player keeps not doing what they were told by the superior officer, they would get punished for it, which is why you don't see that as a role-playing game option. Not to lessons in your Mass Effect, which is just like Mass Effect where Captain Shepard just does everything.
Cough, only war, cough.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so Decipher looked at the problem and solved it by using sticks instead of carrots. They did two things. First of all, commanding officers always act first in the combat sequence or any sequence. So like, what are we going to do? Start with captain. Captain says what goes on first. And the captain could say, well, I'll hear other people out or go first. They're the ranking officer to do that. And the second thing is the captain can tell someone to do something and give them a bonus to do it. Like, okay, I want, put all power in the forward shield. You have a +1 to all of your rolls to do that because I told you to do that. And when the ensign's turn comes up, they could choose, no, that's folly. We've got to put all power in the photons. And they would move, if they don't do what the boss says, nothing happens, but they turned down a bonus.
Mhm.
And so this got in the idea that we wanted that a carrot instead of a stick theory, giving people bonuses to do things that we want them to do is usually the best way you can do it because players should have the free will and they should be allowed to do things. Like I think a big thing is honorable, which shows up in very many versions of our games, which is if you choose to play an honorable character, everyone gets a penalty to stop you from being honorable. But if you choose to stop being honorable, you just revert back to 0. And it's like, well, you spent points on being honorable, so I guess they're wasted right now. But it was just like, you don't actually, it's the wording of it too. You don't get a bonus to be honorable. So you just can't say, I'm going to kill this guy and get +1 on all your rolls. It's, I'm going to be honorable, and if anyone tries to interfere with this honorable duel, they get penalties to do it. And that was specifically so you wouldn't use it as a hammer to get your way. But we gave you a specific bonus, like, because this endorses you to be honorable. You're still being rewarded for it. And, because other people have penalties stop you, but you're doing it for its own sake. And that felt more like what it would be like to be an honorable character.
Right. It also respects the player's autonomy to choose at any time how they want to really act.
I mean, if you want to be a jerk, like if you're watching our Iron Claw stream, you can watch Griffin constantly blowing his anonymous because if he responds to names, he loses his anonymity bonus, which is a increased resistance roll.
Count the number of times I ditch pacifism, everybody.
That's also built into the rules. So even the Blessed, which I didn't play in this game, Blessed wizards all have pacifism. So as soon as they do any aggressive attack, they lose a big buff to all their defenses because pacifism is a defensive buff. And and it was like, that's a specific decision because you're that kind of character because we expect you to get into violent situations, but you've made a morality decision that you will try you're incentivized to try everything you can before you go to violence, but we don't stop you from violence. And that I think is But that's also a player choice. In Ironclaw or any of our games, we have never labeled anyone just, an entire race of people just evil. We don't do that. There may be people who are acting against your best interests, and there are nobles and other clans that are doing evil things. But it's this weird thing that you see in stuff like Charmed or other fantasy shows where evil is an inherent genetic quality that is inherent to these beings. They must be exterminated. Never done that, and it's really distasteful. I think that D&D 5 has gone to the logical conclusion of that kind of weird eugenic statement. So no, we've never we do have immoral and terrible people in our games. Also, we don't give them bonuses for being, as Griffin already pointed out, being able to just kill anybody when I feel like it is already its own reward.
And what a fun reward it is.
I think a final take on this is
in your final words.
I'm working on a rule that I wanted to encourage people to work together. So it's basically it's a hindrance and help rules where if you help somebody, and this is very common in many other games, right? Your difficulty rating goes down, but also you can work together to hinder your enemies as well. And I put that rule because I saw in many games that kind of, or they don't discourage or encourage people just go on their own. So I'm going to just do this and let the other party members be left behind. And I was like, I want to encourage players to work together as a team. So I felt compelled to create a rule set or sub rule set that has that as a bonus, like carrot versus stick. Like you don't get punished for not helping other people, but it's much easier to solve your problems if you say, okay, I'm gonna help this person, and they're gonna get a bonus for that. And if somebody's getting attacked or something, I'm gonna hinder them so that we can, as a group, survive and reach our goal. So with that and the goal orientation, that drives people not to be hopefully murder hoboy. And the description I have so far is, them. In fact, I put it to the GMs like, it depends on how you describe the goal. If you tell someone to kill someone, then your players are going to go and kill them. But if you put it in words and saying, disable or capture or defeat, you're encouraging your players you're opening those options to your players, and your players are a good chance that they are going to go like, wait a minute, defeat doesn't necessarily mean that I got to shoot them in the head, right? And so on and so forth. And I also have a character which most of the stuff that they do is talk, right? They're the face. So that also encourages people. It's like, hey, I have this character that can do these things. Hey.
Yeah.
So.
All right. And Dredd, what kind of closing comments do you think you got here?
So I want to close out by giving my personal GM advice where it comes to rules. I think that whether or not players are conscious of the rules endorsing behavior, I think they do. I agree that they do. And I think that you can get your game moving a lot more efficiently and just playing better if you are at least aware of what the rules are telling you to do. So when I pick up a new game, I look through the rule book, I look at the kind of challenges that are presented and the kind of roles that the players can make, and I try to use that as a starting point for the kinds of stories that can be told with that system. And I think that if you're conscious of that, you'll have a much easier time, and your players will have fun too, because they'll get to roll their dice more often.
All right, then. So I think for now, that'll go ahead and conclude it for this episode of Notes from the Aleph. We stream episodes bi-weekly, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can also join us live at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games on the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is a partner and writer for Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com and join us on the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Quarrels Ironclaw expansion book, where you can engage your own pirate adventures. Don't forget to check out RedRabbit and book him for a game over on startplayinggames.com as RedRabbit. And Lessons, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitch under Lessons Learned 1, and on YouTube under Lessons Learned. And you can find me here on Sundays, GMing a fine group of people playing the classic War of Greyhawk, but under 5th edition rules, Into the Wild Coast.
There we go. So be sure, everyone, to like, subscribe, comment, buy plushies, and come see us all again. Till next time.